Some nights, long after the last lanterns in Red Fern Ridge had been snuffed out, she would hear the wind clawing across the prairie like an unsettled spirit, whispering of secrets buried deep in the soil, of choices made long ago that still rippled through the present. It was on such a night, with the air heavy and expectant, that Abigail Wyn's story truly began. And before I draw you into this tale of promises, sacrifices, and the kind of love that blooms not in the springtime of youth, but in the autumn of endurance, I must ask something simple of you. If you, too, believe that even in the harshest places tenderness can take root, then take a moment to like and subscribe, for this story will carry you through windswept ridges, lonely nights, and the quiet fire of a man's vow. Abigail Wyn had never considered herself the heroine of any story. She was a schoolteacher of 33, a woman whose hair had grown accustomed to the discipline of pens and bonds, whose fingers were ink-stained from chalk and slates, and whose days were measured by the scratch of little hands learning arithmetic in her one-room schoolhouse. She had long since reconciled with solitude, telling herself she had made peace with spinsterhood, but peace was never the same as happiness. Her life was predictable, secure even, but it had hardened into a rhythm as unyielding as the prairie itself, until one afternoon when the jingle of spurs and the shadow of a man darkened her doorway and set her entire world tilting on its axis. Boaz Cutter, his name alone carried a kind of weight among the people of Red Fern Ridge, whispered with the same all one reserved for thunderclouds rolling in over the plains or for a bull elk glimpsed at dawn. He was the man of the mountain's edge, broad as the horizon and nearly as silent, a figure both respected and feared. Abigail had seen him from afar, at church gatherings or town meetings, a presence too large to ignore yet too distant to approach. But that day, he filled the threshold of her schoolhouse, the brim of his hat casting his eyes in shadow until he removed it with a solemnity that seemed to honor both her and the place she had made her sanctuary. The children went still, their slates forgotten, their small breaths caught as though sensing the significance of the moment. Abigail, who had built her life upon composure, found her heart stumble against her ribs as she looked up at him, the silver at his temples glinting like threads of early frost, the weather-lined strength of his jaw softened only by the quiet, unreadable patience of his eyes. "Miss Wyn," he said, his voice a rumble like distant thunder, steady, low, impossible to ignore. He asked her for a word, and when she stepped onto the porch, the prairie stretched vast and merciless behind him. It was as though she stood between two endless forces, the wilderness and the man carved out of it. He did not cloak his words in charm or ceremony. "I need a wife," he said, his eyes holding hers with a gravity that made her breath falter. "And you need strong sons to guard your winters." That was all. No pretty promises, no soft confessions. It should have insulted her, reduced her to a problem to be solved. But instead, there was something almost noble in his plainness, a truth spoken without disguise. Abigail wanted to protest, to remind him that she was more than her winters, more than a body to bear children or a pair of hands to keep a household. Yet beneath his bluntness, she sensed something else, a man stripped bare of pretense, offering not love perhaps, but honesty, and for a woman who had once been left broken by a suitor who valued wealth over heart, such honesty was as rare as water in a drought. She returned to her students that afternoon, but her thoughts were tangled as prairie grass in the wind. Boaz Cutter's words clung to her, unsettling the silence she had grown accustomed to, dragging forth the buried ache of the life she had longed for but denied herself. At home, in the solitude of her lamplit cottage, she unfolded the simple contract he had left with her, a marriage agreement written in his careful hand, offering respect, provision, and partnership, but promising nothing of love. And yet, as her fingers brushed over the steady script, she felt something stir in her chest, a memory of her mother's wedding ring hidden away in a jewelry box, a dream she thought she had buried with her youth. The contract did not lie. It did not lower with false hope. It laid out the stark terms of survival, the binding of two lives for protection and shared labor. But it was the man's presence, the way he had looked at her with those fathomless eyes as though he saw not the spinster schoolteacher, but the woman beneath, that haunted her most. For nights, she wrestled with the choice. Remain the solitary teacher in her modest cottage, or step into the unknown with a man who carried the strength of the land in his bones. The town whispered, of course, as towns always do, their judgments and curiosities circling like carrion birds. Some would call her practical, others desperate, but none of them had stood on that porch. None of them had felt the prairie wind shift as Boaz Cutter asked her, without ornament or flattery, to bind her fate with his. And so, as the October sky stretched wide and endless above, Abigail Wyn prepared to make the choice that would change her life forever, not knowing yet that what began as practicality would soon burn with the unexpected light of devotion, of promises stronger than winter's ice, of a man who would one day vow, with all the fierceness of his mountain heart, that he would lay down his life for her. The wedding itself came without grandeur, held in Reverend Matthew's modest church where the pews smelled of beeswax polish and hymnals worn soft by generations of hands. The witnesses few but curious, the vows spoken with the same frank simplicity that had defined Boaz's proposal. Abigail wore her best blue wool dress, the one that brought out the hazel of her eyes, and carried a small bouquet of prairie wildflowers he had gathered himself, purple asters and golden black-eyed Susans, blooms so humble, yet so carefully chosen that when she looked down at them in her hands, her throat tightened with a gratitude she could not voice. They spoke no words of love in that ceremony, only promises to care, to endure, to protect. But when Boaz pressed a kiss to her knuckles after the vows, a gesture small, reverent, unexpectedly tender, it set a warmth blooming in her chest that lingered long after the church doors closed behind them, and they rode toward their new life together. The ranch house loomed against the autumn sky, larger than Abigail had imagined, its logs weathered but solid, a place built not merely to survive the prairie but to endure in it. And within its walls she discovered evidence of Boaz's hidden depths, shelves lined with books, volumes of Shakespeare and Emerson, a piano inherited from his mother though he admitted he could not play, curtains newly hung in the windows, and in the east-facing room he had prepared for her, a writing desk carefully placed to catch the morning light, as if he had thought of her life as a teacher and made space for it before she had even spoken the request. That night they ate beef stew and fresh bread at the broad wooden table, their meal quiet but companionable, and when she spoke of her students, of Tommy Fletcher's stubborn struggle with arithmetic, of Sarah Mitchell's brilliance with words, of the challenges of teaching children aged 6 to 14 all within one room, Boaz listened with an attentiveness she had never known from a man, asking questions that showed not only patience but understanding, nodding in the way of someone who knew that building anything, whether cattle herds or young minds, took both grit and gentleness. In return, he told her of the land, of the delicate balance between grazing and conservation, of the way the wind could shift overnight and bring ruin to a season's labor, of the quiet satisfaction of repairing a fence or watching calves stand for the first time. She began to see in him not just a rancher, but a man rooted as deeply to the soil as the cottonwoods along the creeks. Their arrangement, practical and cautious, unfolded into a rhythm. She rose early to prepare breakfast, walked to the schoolhouse with her slate tucked under her arm, returned in the afternoons to the steady figure of Boaz working the fields or tending the stock, and in the evenings they shared the quiet of the parlor, she with her lesson plans or books, he with his ranch accounts or repairs. Sometimes they read aloud to one another, the sound of her voice filling the lamplight air as he watched her with that unblinking, intent gaze, and once when she faltered over a line of Tennyson, self-conscious at the tremor in her voice, he said simply, "Your voice makes the words live," in a tone so roughened by sincerity that she found herself blushing like a girl of 17. Though they kept separate bedrooms, a distance maintained out of respect, and perhaps mutual fear of crossing too quickly into intimacy, small gestures began to slip past their careful boundaries. His hand lingering as he helped her from the wagon, her laughter breaking free when he teased her gently about burning the bread, the brush of shoulders as they stood together at the bookshelves. It was at church that the change became visible to others, when Boaz suggested, almost shyly, that he might take her arm so they would not look so much like strangers. She agreed, and as they entered together, his strength steady beneath her hand, she saw the approving nods, the satisfied looks. that told her their union was becoming believable even to those who had doubted, though for her it was not pretense, but a strange new comfort. Afterward, when a townsman remarked that marriage seemed to agree with her, she felt Boaz's hand tighten imperceptibly on her arm as he replied, "I'm a fortunate man," his voice carrying pride that reached beyond performance. And when she looked up at him in that moment, she glimpsed something in his eyes that unsettled her, a tenderness blooming where once there had only been practicality. And yet, beneath the quiet happiness, shadows stirred. Whispers from neighbors who questioned whether a woman like Abigail had bound herself to Boaz from desperation, and the watchful eyes of Marcus Blackwood, the neighboring rancher, whose smile never touched his calculating gaze, lingered too long when it fell upon her. At home, however, the prairie seemed to soften around her. She found joy in planting the kitchen garden Boaz had surprised her with, feeling the soil cling to her hands like a promise of permanence. And when she told him it felt hopeful, he knelt beside her in the earth, his enormous frame bent close, and repeated the word, hopeful, as if tasting it for the first time. Their days stretched from dawn till dusk in this quiet companionship. No fireworks, no declarations, but something steadier, something that grew like roots beneath the surface, unseen yet undeniable. And so Abigail, who had once sworn herself to solitude, found herself glancing toward her husband in the lamplight and wondering, with equal parts fear and wonder, what might blossom from the seeds they had sown together, if respect and necessity, watered by kindness and shared labor, could grow into love strong enough to weather the storms that lay waiting on the horizon. It was in the gray bite of November that the test of their union came, when Marcus Blackwood rode up with his hired men and his forged deeds, demanding what was never his, threatening not only Boaz's land but Abigail's life, his cold words dripping with the malice of a man who thought intimidation could bend anyone to his will. Abigail stood beside her husband in that bitter wind, the fraudulent paper burning like a brand against her chest where she had hidden it, and though her heart pounded, she found her voice steady as steel as she told Blackwood he had underestimated her, that she would not be cowed nor broken, that this was her home as much as Boaz's, and she would fight for it. What followed was less the clamor of battle than the hard silence of a standoff, the community of Red Fern Ridge quietly taking their stand with the Cutters, rifles in hand, weary of Blackwood's cruelty. And when the man finally slunk away with his lies exposed and his power broken, the air seemed to lift with the weight of 20 years' worth of unspoken fear. That night, in the glow of the hearth, Boaz sat with his head bowed, the great mountain of him suddenly vulnerable, and he whispered that he had been prepared to lay down his life for her, to face bullets or worse rather than see her harmed. Abigail, resting her hand against his calloused one, answered that she had not married him for protection alone, that his vow was not his burden to carry alone, because they were bound now by more than practicality. They were bound by choice, by loyalty, by something that had become love. And so they sat together, no longer strangers bound by contract, but husband and wife in the truest sense, the prairie wind howling beyond their windows while inside their home burned with a steady warmth, a flame kindled not in haste but in patience, a promise made at dawn and cherished till dusk, one that would carry them through every winter yet to come.